it's interesting. I came here to do a sort of sales pitch for the Battlefields Trust, and I was a little bit taken aback by it, or pleased really, about just how many members of the trust have turned up. So it's not really a case of it may be in here, but it's not we few, we happy few in the conference as a whole. So really what this talk is about is an overview of where we are with the preservation and the protection and the promotion of battlefields in this country. A lot of us obviously care about this, and if somebody questions you, there might be one or two little tips in here of things that you can use in discussions at the pub or elsewhere. I wouldn't go there, it's just a field. The reason why I put this up is it was the first conversation I had when I started working for the Battlefields Trust about 5 years ago. I thought, well, let's just see what the baseline is with British battlefields. So I had a look on the map and I chose Solway Moss, so that mid-16th century battle up near Carlisle. And so I phoned up the local tourist information centre, and I said, "Oh, I've seen on the Ordnance Survey map that there's a cross swords just north of Carlisle at Solway Moss. What's all that about then?" And the tourist information guy said to me, "I wouldn't go there. It's just a field." So I thought, right, this is going to be an interesting few years that I'm going to be working on here. And really, what the Battlefields Trust, I think, is about is making sure, if we possibly can, that nobody ever says that again. That, you know, that they're not just a field. And in fact, I was able to go to that tourist information centre to meet the chap, and I put the argument to him, and I said, you know, we've got to talk about this, and I explained, you know, how I saw this. So I thought that we'll just have a little look at such things. Well, why are they not just the field battles? Well, first of all, of course, they are incidents that led to great changes in our history. I tried the great Churchillian comment, isn't it, about battles being the punctuation marks of history, and occasionally one or two full stops, actually. So Hastings, of course, where we have a change in rulership, but also major changes in our society, in our language, and also in our place within Northwest Europe, changing us from being something that was perhaps part of Scandinavia in many ways to something that looked much more across the Channel to Normandy and Northwest Europe. Moving on, get there in the end, if I can get this to work. Magnificent memorial down at Lewes, which was sort of introduced by the splendidly named Sir Tufton Beamish. If you called that, you've got to be interested in battles, haven't you, really? And, you know, there at Lewes, I think we've got development, unwittingly, I should say, of our democracy, of our parliamentary democracy today. Although I think if you'd said that to any of de Montfort's rebels at the time, they'd have packed up and gone home straight away, wouldn't they? Bannockburn, Scottish independence, clearly important in that. Naseby, again, the rule of Parliament, I suppose, although perhaps it's better to see it as perhaps the defeat of royal absolutism. But these are all key moments in our history. Also, of course, battles lead to the development of major figures, and just one, for example, is our man Oliver Cromwell, whose successes on the battlefield actually turned him really into somebody that had the opportunity to intervene in politics because of the way that he rose through his victories at Winceby, Mastermore, Naseby, and so on and so on. It gave him the opportunity, but more than that, it gave him the inclination to intervene in politics, because being a Calvinist and a believer in providence, he saw the victories on the battlefield as example of divine approval. So therefore his seizure of power was based upon divine right, which ironically, of course, is what he was fighting against with Charles I. But there we are. Another figure, I suppose, that we have to talk about here, that one speculates about this, but of course it's because of Agincourt that we're seeing today, that we're studying today, that I think Henry V is so well known. I don't know what would have happened if they'd have just packed up and gone home after Harflow, whether the country would have been prepared to continue funding excursions to France. That I don't know. But of course, it also nearly put a stop to Henry V, because
actually, if this painting was accurate, there'd be a blooming great scar down the side of his face because he was hit in the face by an arrow at the Battle of Shrewsbury. And we can still read the account by the surgeon of how he managed to get that arrow out. What about a poisoned chalice? You know, here's your success or failure, I think, would have both had a major part on that surgeon's career. Fortunately for him and for Henry, it was success. But also, so there's that historical importance, but also battlefields in themselves are important because of the landscape evidence that we have there. And this is, if anybody's been up there, this is the battlefield of Flodden, which is just inside the English border. But really, to get a kind of understanding, I think, of that battle, you need to walk the battlefield. It's there when you try and walk down those steep slopes that you understand why the Scottish pike blocks ran into so much trouble on that battlefield to try and keep the momentum. You know, you realise why really a pike formation needed level ground on which to fight, and the steep slopes of Flodden, followed by a nasty bit of marsh at the bottom, and then an unexpected slope up to the English positions. You can see why James IV's army disintegrated really into chaos and bloody defeat on that day. And of course, these battlefields contain a considerable amount of archaeological evidence. It varies from battlefield to battlefield. But perhaps one of the most significant is Naseby, where a major archaeological project was carried out using controlled metal detecting. And it taught us so much about that battle because, you know, if you read the history books until relatively recently, you get the idea that the Royalists attacked. Prince Rupert was successful on one side, went off to attack the baggage. On the other side, Cromwell was successful. Cromwell wheeled his troops in, and the Royalists were basically surrounded and destroyed. But in fact, what this shows is that wasn't the case at all, and that there was a fighting retreat going back several miles. So the battle, the ground there, and this is through metal detecting and finding the scatter of the musket balls that have been left in the soil there. You'll notice that here there's a huge collection of finds there, and the accounts say that Prince Rupert's bluecoats stood like a wall of brass and made a last stand, perhaps to cover the retreat of the rest of the army. And if you look on the plans of the time, that's where Prince Rupert's bluecoats would have been, and you can see how that stand is evidenced really by that fall of shot. And as a result, there is now a memorial on that spot, put there actually by the Sealed Knot Society, but quite a useful development out of the archaeology there. So we've got the archaeological evidence on the ground. This is Culloden, and the work that was done at Culloden has greatly changed our understanding of where, for example, the government army was drawn up, with the result that the visitor centre, the new visitor centre, is kind of off the battlefield now. They've moved it as a result of it. So the ground contains this evidence. We know a lot more about the way that the attacking rebels were defeated, the use of artillery, and so on, and in the ground that's there. They're also a place, I think, that, how can I put it, that generates activity. This is the Tewkesbury Battlefield Festival, which is major activity. And in fact, the town of Tewkesbury, if you go to Tewkesbury, it kind of defines itself now by that battle. It's become a focus of activity in all kinds of ways. And, you know, in these days when we know the cost of everything and the value of very little, the fact that it brings in an enormous amount of money, which is often spent, particularly by these gentlemen, on the various brewed products of Tewkesbury, but it's a major player in Tewkesbury's economy. But going from that large scale, there's also some quite interesting projects going on around the country, and evidence of this is at Tewkesbury, where local people of all kinds, so it's not just the usual old buffs like us, but it's women, it's children, etc., all kinds of people involved in a project where they're creating these banners. This is Sir George Brown's that you can see there. There's a Courtney banner at the back. You see this lady hard at work painting George Brown's banners. And if anybody went to the talk earlier on about weaponry at Agincourt, we would have heard that banners were painted and not embroidered. So here it is, that tradition going on. So she's hard at work. Woman in the background, not quite so hard at work, but you get the idea here. they're wonderful, those banners. I don't know if anybody has been to Tewkesbury, but it gives this is what you get in Tewkesbury during the summer. A whole series of these banners. I love the fact when I last went there that you've got the banner of Edward IV, and you probably are aware that they said about Edward IV that he pursued women without distinction, the old, the young, the married, the single, the rich, the poor. And Edward IV's banner was hanging over a lingerie shop when I went there. So I thought it was very, very fitting, in fact. So you can see how that battle, the Battle of Tewkesbury, has become a fundamental part of the image, the self-image, actually, of the town of Tewkesbury. But ultimately, we have a good old laugh about that, but ultimately they're about places where people lost their lives. And it's famously said that 28,000 people lost their lives in a day at Towton. This is almost certainly a huge exaggeration. It's inconceivable that number of people would have been killed on that day. Similarly, I think that the dead here at Stoke Field, which is really the last battle of the Wars of the Roses, the last, I can't even call them Yorkists really, they're sort of Ricardian army, which tried to challenge Henry VII, was defeated. It's not Stoke-on-Trent, it's just south of Newark, and the Battlefields Trust is currently working on trying to do a trail around it. But 7,000 people lost their lives. Well, maybe fewer than that. But 700 people lost their lives. 70 people lost their lives. You think about anybody in your own family that has died. The impact that it has on a lot of people. So these are places where terrible things happened, really, and down at a most basic level. We have the quite horrific evidence of death and wounding from the 40 or so remains of skeletons uncovered at Towton. You see that this chap has had first-hand evidence of some kind of weapon that was demonstrated. And interestingly, you can see in his jaw that he actually recovered from another wound and lived on to fight again and then die at Towton. So, I think it's a very important thing about battlefields, that they are places of memorial. And sometimes we sort of say it's a shame that there isn't a memorial at this battle or that battle or whatever. The ground itself should be the memorial, in my opinion. But it's interesting, isn't it, how, and you often hear people say this, how in a way we seem to overlook our battlefields in this country. And we make comparisons, for example, with America, the United States, and the battlefields of the Civil War. And you think that 10, 20 times more school groups will go over to Ypres than would ever go to Naseby, for example. Without a doubt of it. And you can see a group just outside of Ypres. You've got in Flanders Fields Museum, which huge number, more English kids visit Flanders Fields Museum, I suspect, than the National Army Museum in London. But why is that? Well, I suppose the reason is that our national cavalry is the First World War. That's what shapes, I think, our image of warfare. It was our first war that this country fought, I suppose, on a truly industrial scale, where we took on the main effort of the main enemy, and so on and so on. And so those images, where for example, the one here of the mud, are greatly ingrained in our minds. So when we think about our warfare and our military effort, we look overseas. I'm pretty sure, I think that's where we look. We look over to northwest Europe, over to Flanders and Picardy in particular. For the Americans, their national cavalry was the American Civil War. And, more Americans died in the American Civil War than all their other wars put together. And, of course, it's at home as well. So, therefore, you get huge concentration of memorials to an extent that we will never have in this country. I would argue. Yet all is not lost. If you look around the country, there are now increasingly museums and visitor centres connected with our battles. Quite recently, a new Civil War centre has opened in Europe that's well worth a visit, in fact. But of course, we have the visitor centre at Hastings. Interestingly, one of the first things the Battlefields Trust had to do was to go into battle against English Heritage, who proposed to put that visitor centre and cafe slap bang in the middle of the battlefield. But it was a bit of a white knuckle ride, but we managed to persuade them that was probably a bad idea, and now it is where it is now in a slightly better place, if indeed that is the battlefield, but that's another story. Bosworth, well, you will be aware, I'm sure, that the Battlefields Trust was involved in the major project, Glenn Ford in particular, to find the site of the Battle of Bosworth, or at least find the evidence for the site of the battle. He wasn't the person that came up with that idea that the battle was in fact 2 miles away from where the visitor centre is and where it was always thought to be, but he was the person that led the project that found that evidence. But a fine visitor centre, and in a way, I think it's better that it's off the battlefield anyway. I don't think we were wanted in the middle of it. And interestingly, the Bosworth anniversary is coming up in a couple of weeks, and bookings for their anniversary event are up 400% this year. Well, I think we can probably gather why. It might be something to do with the chap that's buried in Leicester. But good news for all of us really over that. Culloden, new visitor centre there, and this has got to be the worst PR picture that I've ever seen. And this is a workman at the new Bannockburn Centre, pointing. Well, you can see what's going on. Do I need to say any more? I don't think I would have agreed had I been the PR person there to have that picture. But there we are. I'm talking about it, aren't I? Interestingly, the Bannockburn Visitor Centre has just won a Sanford Award for Education. Well worth a visit if you go up there. I think they've picked up on what Flicks, in particular children's switches, in terms of video games, etc. But they put it in a very, very good historical context, very much based upon the evidence of the time, the weaponry, and the landscape. So well worth a visit if you ever want to pop up there. On a sort of smaller scale, the Battlefields Trust has worked very hard over the years to try and put up information panels. They give you something physical, a waypoint on the battlefields. This one is at Ramway Down in Devizes, and the Trust has a lot of projects based trying to put up information panels like this around the country. This one, Dr. Chris Scott, who's actually at the conference, provided a lot of the work for. So we're always working on doing these. Gets a lot of people involved because you've got artwork, you've got research, you've got copywriting, you've got a lot of dealings with local councils and so on. So quite an important aspect of our work. And we've advised on things. This was the couple of years ago, the Globe Theatre actually went out on tour, and we helped them locate places on battlefields that they might want to put their plays on. This is Towton. Has to be done with a certain amount of care. Similarly with reenactments on battlefields, because you don't want to kind of corrupt the archaeology that's in the ground, And if you were to, as I do know, if you were to metal detect at Hastings, you'd find lots of rings and bits of broken weaponry, etc. But it's stuff that reenactors over the years have dropped down there. So one has to perhaps work on it in a sort of educational way over that. This worked out very well for me because I took the director to the pub up at Towton, and a Guardian journalist turned up. And never believe what you read in the papers. He wrote later that I was the Globe Theatre's historical consultant. I didn't complain, and actually I got some work from the Hollow Crown out of it, so it was quite good thing. But, yeah. And enough said about the White Queen. Whatever we say about the White Queen, it gives you some lovely views of Bruges, doesn't it? And but it increases that interest. We have quite a lot of. It's always difficult, isn't it, to know, is it better to have something that's misleading or nothing at all? I'd rather go for the misleading myself. Well, I'd rather go for the accurate, but one has to sort of play that you have to play the game to a certain extent. But one of the key things that the Trust is involved in, I think, is trying to locate where battlefields are. In itself, it's important because it helps us understand what happened, but it's crucial in the defence of battlefields. And a good example of this is Fulford, which the evidence for Fulford is, let's say, it's not compelling about the location of the battle. It's quite convincing, but it's not compelling. And it wasn't enough to get English Heritage to put it on its list of battlefields, registered battlefields. And as a result, it made Fulford very, very vulnerable to developers because they were able to sort of say, oh, well, it's not quite clear that it was there anyway. So it does if we're not certain about where battlefields are, it does lead to that danger. And it certainly happened at Fulford. It works the other way as well. You may have seen in the news maybe a year or 2 years ago that a chap argued that the Battle of Hastings was actually fought down at Crowhurst, with no evidence whatsoever, none whatsoever. However, the nature of the British media nowadays is that they tend to report rather than investigate. So consequently, they reported that claim without investigating, and then it gets picked up and it runs with it, and it was run with, and it was run with. The fact that, in fact, the Bexhill Link Road was going through the new site of this claims site of the battlefield, and it was this chap's kind of back garden, may have had something to do with the claims, I don't know. But very important. So research into battlefields. At the moment, the Trust is doing some work, in particular at Stowe, the last battle of the English Civil War, so First Civil War, and we hope to be able to be a little bit clearer about what happened and where, and that's just one example of some of the work that we're doing. But metal detecting is something that we have to work very hard over. In the right way, it's an extremely effective archaeological tool. Not on its own, you need to have it as part of a holistic project. So you need to study, for example, at Bosworth, soil analysis, place name analysis, a revisit of the sources, an attempt to reconstruct the historic landscape. Then you do the metal detecting. But of course, it's fun. It's lovely if you find things, isn't it? You know, in the ground, you can bung them on eBay, or you can keep them at home, etc. But of course, it's taking that evidence out of context, and it's destroying the context of what's there. That's what's left for us to find. So if a place has been really turned over, we don't know how to interpret what is left in the ground. So there's a big effort really with metal detecting to educate really and to sort of say, you know, it's a great thing, but try and do it as part of an archaeological project. We've supported a local initiative, brilliant one at Taunton, where they've actually got all of the local landowners to say that there's to be no metal detecting, none at all. And therefore that means if you're driving past and you see some bloke out there that's metal detecting, you know he shouldn't be there. You know, it was a major step forward by the Taunton Battlefield Society over that, and also to get the local police to take it seriously. They did a very, very good campaign indeed. And then official metal detecting, you have to wear a hideous pink fluorescent jacket with Taunton on it, etc. And that way they've managed to a certain extent, control the metal detecting. But elsewhere, it's been unfortunate, not very far from here at Cheriton, just outside of Winchester, near Alresford, Civil War battle, 1644. It's been well and truly turned over the years, and it's very difficult to make sense of what's left, of which there's a lot, but we don't know how important the bits that have been found are in the context of the whole battlefield. We also have to try and defend against planning applications and convince local councils that they've got something really worth protecting there. And a classic example of this is Northampton, where all of the things that you worry about have happened, really, in the sense that you've got people saying, actually, the battlefield isn't there, it's there anyway, etc., etc. So you've got that going on. You've got local organisations digging bits up willy-nilly, and we're just hoping that the council do something about this, because it is a registered battlefield. Now, what do I mean by a registered battlefield? Well, English Heritage have taken about 50 battlefields, ranging from now Lostwithiel down in the southwest up to Flodden, Halidon Hill in the northeast, and they've given them a registered status. But that registration is a bit of a paper tiger, really, because what it actually means is that the status of it as a battlefield has to be taken account of in the planning process, but it doesn't mean you can't do anything. And really, it's a recipe for legal disputes, because what it says in the National Planning Policy Framework, which is the thing which English Heritage, or which is now Historic England, have put forward, is that large-scale development on registered battlefields should be generally not permitted But what is large scale? What does generally mean? And you're constantly balancing against benefit and loss over it. And our job as the Battlefields Trust is to try and make that argument for the loss if you destroy a battlefield. Classic example of this is HS2 going through the battlefield of Agincourt. Important battle from the Wars of the Roses. It's been described as the Welsh Flodden, and some people argue that Henry Tudor's advance through Wales was facilitated by the deaths of so many Yorkist Welshmen at this battle, 1469, I think it was. But we make the argument, but then this is an example where they say, well, actually, it should be wholly exceptional because of the benefit of HS2. Well, I'll leave you to make your minds up about that. And these are quite a new development. And you understand why somebody who's struggling to make a living, who's got university fees to pay and who hasn't got enough pension, might want to give up their land for solar arrays. And farmers are being asked if they're interested in doing it. They're being approached to say. And there's been a flurry of applications for solar arrays over the last few years, solar arrays and also wind farms. Now, we managed, really, thanks to the efforts of our members, actually, to get an application to put a wind turbine, a very big one, right on the edge of the battlefield of Sedgemoor. If you've been to Sedgemoor, you will know that the thing about it is it's just its flatness, really, and all that you see are the church towers of Weston Zoyland and Chedsoy. And right on the edge of that battlefield, there was an application to put a large wind turbine in. That we were able to fight off. There have been a number of applications to build solar arrays on battlefields. One at Langport, not that far from Sedgemoor, went ahead, but we were able to actually get it reduced so that actually when you're on the main part of the battlefield, you don't see it. But very worryingly, there was an application to put a solar array like this slap bang in the middle of the battlefield of Winceby, which was Cromwell and Fairfax's great sort of starting victory in 1643 over the Royalists from Lincoln. And English Heritage didn't object to it, even though it was in the centre of their registered battlefield. They didn't object to it. They said that it's temporary. Well, it is kind of temporary, isn't it? But once you've started with something like this and you've made the precedent, it's very easy for it to develop from there. So we've still got some work to do, even with English Heritage, or historic England, as I should say. How do we do it? Really, what you want to be is a position where you're not on the back foot, where you're not having to react to things. It's up for the Battlefields Trust and its members, many of us are here today, to make sure that those battlefields are in a position where the local tourist information centre, the local council say, oh, it's just a field. A little bit blurry here, but this was a panel that we put at Newbury Battlefield, because there's a great pressure on development at Newbury, plans to build new houses. And actually the area where First Battle of Newbury was fought, 1643, was earmarked for potential development. So we thought we'd better get a panel down there so at least people know what's going on, and from that it sort of develops. So here you can see the opening of that panel. And of course walks around battlefields. This is Dr. Peter Burley, taking a group around the site of the First Battle of St Albans, which I need to say, significant action at a sort of fairly low level, I suppose, although not for the significance of the people that were killed at it, of the Wars of the Roses. A good way of getting local people to know what they've got in their area, but also it's pretty good fun to go on them actually and to lead them. So it's quite an important activity. So we've got, as a Battlefields Trust, we've got fighting for against developments, but we try to do it in a more positive way than that, and try if we can get the various battlefields in this country to be valued by their local communities, by their local councils, and so on, for the arguments that I gave at the beginning. And that finally leads you to that we produce Battlefield, which is the Battlefields Trust magazine. Now, it has a number of purposes, this. First of all, it's got interesting articles in it. So Anne Curry has written about Agincourt on here. Now, in terms of protection, really, we can't go much further than this country. It's quite difficult for an English organisation to persuade, for example, somewhere in France or Russia that they shouldn't be doing something on their battlefields. What we can do, though, is to make our views felt and let people know that they have an international significance. So that's why in this magazine we have this time, for example, article on the anniversary of Battle of Agincourt, Battle of Lewes, Magna Carta, Battle of Waterloo. There might be a theme going here connected with a date, mightn't there, you know, in that way. But I mentioned that this article was done by Professor Curry, but not all our articles are done by academics. It's also an opportunity for people who may have started off in their career or their interest in military history to have their first go at doing it. And so in here, you know, we help them write articles, get them published. They can learn the discipline of writing, meeting a deadline, checking their sources, and so on and so on. So it's a sort of multifaceted tool, this Battlefield magazine. And I'm going to finish just by thanking you really to listen to my kind of sales pitch about the Battlefields Trust. We're very pleased to be connected with this with this brilliant conference. And please, if you haven't already done so, do go into the room opposite where we've got a stand. In fact, we've got Graham Turner's latest painting of the Battle of Agincourt in there, which I was kind of pleased to get, but it's a terrible responsibility to have it there, you know. And when the person next door was getting ready to open up some books with a knife, I got a bit worried, you know, in that way. But do go through and have a look. And if you're not a member of the Battlefields Trust, do come and talk to us about possibly joining. It's through having a large membership. Over the last 5 years, our membership has grown from about 400 to about 1,200. And obviously, the more voices that we have, the more we can do in arguing for the defence and the promotion of our battlefields. I'm around, as is my colleague David Austin. Tomorrow, we'll be next door. We'll also be going over to Portchester, Titchfield and Mary Rose. So if you've got any questions about what the Trust does, want to know about what there is in your particular locality, information about visits overseas that we're organising, come and ping us then and we'll be delighted to chat to you. Thanks for coming to me when you had those interesting swords next door. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.